So we're going to look at some of the stuff today that's writing, sort of hints for writing for broadcast. It will contrast with some of the stuff that you do in your writing for paper, because in broadcast you're dealing with pictures and words and sound and short. It's very short, and so the words that you choose have to be different. And what we end up with is kind of three things: succinct, conversational, but still accurate. So you use small words and you use words that sound like you're having a conversation with someone, even though you're not. This is sort of like if you've done speech, which I know you have, that it's an extemporaneous speech. Sounds like the person did not rehearse, but they did. And that's why it sounds like they didn't rehearse. Well, good copy for broadcast sounds like it wasn't written. It sounds like it's just that guy sitting there or that woman sitting there talking to you about what happened today. Now, maybe if I start clicking on the left click button, since this guy is dead today. So it sounds like just talking, but it isn't. You use shorter words, and unlike real conversations, you don't have like in that kind of copy. So no verbalized pauses in there, and it's really on a fast track, seeing to get through it all. So there are certain things that we use in regular kinds of writing for publication that's going to be different. So we would not say Southwest Baptist University Vice President for Enrollment Management and Student Retention Mary Smith told KY3 News that. We would instead say Southwest Baptist University's Mary Smith told KY3 News that. Or more likely we would say a Southwest Baptist University official or administrator said that, depending on how important that person is in the story. But you notice what it is it's shorter. You can't give the person's entire title when you introduce them in there the way that you can when you're writing something. When you're writing it for paper. And so, because it's spoken, your titles go in front. So Secretary of State George P. Shultz. Do you guys know who Secretary of State George P. Shultz was? No, he was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan when I was in grade school and high school. But you would not say George P. Shultz, Secretary of State. But for writing purposes, for writing for publication, for print, this is fine. We use that all the time. Whether or not, which one are we going to use? We're going to use the one that makes a sentence flow better as you read it. But for broadcast, that title goes in, it goes in the front. So do we use names? Similar to if we're writing something to print, sometimes you would, sometimes you wouldn't. But less likely in broadcast writing than in print writing. 2 Bolivar residents sustained minor injuries in a crash on Highway 13 early this morning after their car hit a deer. John Edward Melville Smith and Michael Andrew Somerset Jones, both of Bolivar, sustained minor injuries in a crash on Highway 13 early this morning. So the problem is that your story is over by the time you read their names, especially if they have like those really long names like that. And what did it add to it? Not a whole lot. So now if it was, the mayor of Bolivar Mayor Chris Warwick was injured when his car hit a deer, that would be different, right? But if it's just a couple of regular guys, it's not they're not as relevant to the story. And while you might include them in a newspaper story, you probably wouldn't in a broadcast. So we have numbers. We love numbers. We have sometimes entire chapters called Reporting with Numbers. And those are nice. I like those because you can dig into the numbers and you can see, hey, look at this. This is awesome. We discovered some kind of information that was interesting, and now we can relay it to our audience, and they're going to learn something. Well, you can put it in table form. You can have something that when they read it the first time, they're like, let me read that again to be sure I got it right. You can put more complexity into something that's printed. But for broadcast, no, you can't. It comes and goes in a hurry. So that person is sitting there eating a piece of pizza while watching your news broadcast. And the dog is coming by and the kids are coming by and all of this, and you just don't have that opportunity to engage somebody in a deeper set of things. And so numbers for the channel that we're using, they need to just be rounded off. No, not 15 million, 120,000. No, about 15 million. It's good enough. It's good enough for what we're doing. It will get our point across. So similarly, when we write something, we might use occasionally more sophisticated words. Now, my dad wrote some stories back in 1980. He took a class in a junior college in Houston, San Jacinto Community College, and he was a reporter. And I've read the stories that he wrote because he sent them to me one time. He said, hey, I found all these old stories, and he sent them to me. I was reading them at the same time that I'm teaching news writing. And I was laughing because maybe back then, more so than now, the vocabulary was a little bit at a higher level, and the sentence structure was a little more complex than what I was teaching. And I kind of chuckled and said, hey, this is really good writing, but I don't know if some of the folks are going to be able to understand it today. And I would have taken his pieces and said, hey, make these a little bit more fifth grade level. But his editor, who was, I guess, the professor, she got to where she didn't read his stuff anymore hardly, because it was pretty good. It didn't have any mistakes in it. So we'll use shorter words and words that are easier to pronounce, because that poor anchor is reading what we say as opposed to the audience is reading it off of the page. Does it matter what words you write, whether they're hard to pronounce, when you're writing for print? Not really, not much. So this is a funny thing. You go into a Bible study, and it's like, okay, we're going to read the scripture. And they come across these names that nobody knows how to say them in the group. Nobody, except maybe some Redford people, right? But nobody knows how to say this. And they and they try to say it out. And it's like, look, don't. Just act like you know what it's supposed to sound like and say it. None of the rest of us know what it's supposed to sound like either. Well, you don't want that to happen to your anchor in a news story. They need to have words that are easier to pronounce, one, and if it's something that's unknown, well, you can spell it out phonetically so that they can understand. Okay, this is how you say it, so that you don't end up with them looking bad on TV because of that. But if it's again in print, it doesn't really matter. So keep that in mind, that when you write your copy, read it out loud. See, do you have any problem stumbling over words that are hard to pronounce? So you will have contractions, and we say in English writing and stuff, sometimes I can remember teachers saying, don't use contractions. Get it? Don't use contractions. But you do use contractions. It's too informal, but it's not too informal when you're writing for broadcast because you want it to be a little bit informal. However, sometimes you might need to use both words, because if you use a contraction and the person's reading over it and the people are listening to it, they might not catch whether it was one way or the other. For example, the mayor said she decided to run for re-election. The mayor said she's decided to run for re-election. Now, assuming that this was somewhat unknown and people were curious, is the mayor going to run for re-election? This is obviously had been an issue in the town, right? The mayor said she has decided to run for re-election. And so you have it out there so that your anchor can emphasize the has. So the mayor said she's decided to run for re-election. The mayor said she has decided to run for re-election. Either one of those are correct, right, and accurate, but the second one is probably better in the context of the story. Other things that help us to make them flow better, how do we use like a preposition in certain cases? The Senate Armed Services Committee spokesman announced a series of new hearings on budget cuts. A spokesman for the Senate Armed Services Committee is easier to read than the Senate Armed Services Committee's spokesman. And so when you read it out loud and you say, okay, how is that flowing? Maybe you just take that, change it to a preposition, makes it a little bit easier. So verbs, active versus passive voice verbs. We want to use active verbs as much as possible. Now this is something that, of course, applies not just in broadcast copy, but in other writing as well. If you can get rid of those weak verbs, any verbs that need help, it needs a bunch of adverbs to help it, let's find a verb that's strong enough by itself. So using active verbs makes for shorter, remember we want short, and more immediate action sentences. So if you find by in the sentence, that's oftentimes like a quick check mark that says, hey, maybe this is a passive voice and I'm going to reword it and make it a little clearer. And here are some examples of these passive versus active. These I grabbed out of our text. 9 hamburgers were devoured by the hungry dog. The hungry dog devoured 9 hamburgers. Wow, I'm wondering how the hungry dog managed to get 9 hamburgers. Were they on a plate? Kind of like, some dog stealing food off of the table. Was this just a dog that wanted food, or maybe is the dog a big part of this story? I don't know, but I'm now curious about the dog and the eating of those hamburgers that he devoured. My brother-in-law has a dog, and the dog came to visit my in-laws, and we took our dog down as well. And when I read this and it said 9 hamburgers were devoured by the hungry dog, it reminded me of Baylor, the black lab that belongs to my nephew Charlie, versus Snoopy, the black lab that we have. Charlie takes a pancake and flips it up in the air, and the thing goes tossing like this, lands on the floor, and the dog inhaled it like that. And so this is an example, perhaps devoured. You could have said ate, right? The hungry dog ate 9 hamburgers, but we don't know in what way he ate them. Well, in my mind's eye, when I read devoured, I thought about that other dog, and that pancake landed on the floor, and it was gone in under a second. The dog had taken it and eaten it. And so when you're writing something, you know, the dog ate something, yeah, so the more, that verb is stronger than just to say he ate it. It describes kind of how he ate it. And so the motion was approved by the Senate approved the motion, the game was won by the Wildcats. I should have changed that to Bearcats. The Bearcats won the game. And so, again, it makes it shorter, it makes it just kind of fit better. So adverbs and adjectives. So you guys read Ernest Hemingway? Please say yes. The Old Man and the Sea and all those other things. Yeah, he was famous for using fewer words. And a lot of early journalists were, you know, a lot of these guys that were authors were also journalists, and that was a thing. I think he was one who was quoted as saying he liked the telegraph because it made you get rid of, you know, unneeded words. And you do want to get rid of unneeded words and only use the words that are going to move your story forward, that are useful. So, you know, if you can take it out and it doesn't change the meaning or tone or impression that you're creating, why is it in there, right? Why is it there? Get rid of it. How many times have you found something and you find a piece of writing and you go through it and it's just, okay, well, what if we just eliminate this entire section of words here and we still have all the same information and it really doesn't change the meaning or the feel that we get from it. So go through and strike those things out and use the ones that work well. So attribution. When we're writing for newspapers or magazines, attribution can go in a variety of places. You can put it at the beginning of the sentence, in the middle of the sentence, at the end of the sentence, and people have a sense of where it's going to be, right? That, okay, if I see quotation marks and they're reading and I'm reading along, I know that when I get to the end, it's going to say, somebody said. You know this. Your readers know it. You don't have to put somebody said and then all of that at the beginning. But in broadcast, you do want to do that because we don't know who's talking. And you don't want to have your anchor up there having to introduce a quote by saying, changing their voice or saying quote or something. You want to put the attribution at the beginning of the sentence. And so here's a newspaper example. This is an example of the worst brutality I've ever come across, was the way the judge described the beating of a man arrested by police. So we know from the quotation marks that this is going to be, oh, and I've got a missing quotation mark in there. I'll correct that later. But we know that there's going to be somebody who said that at the end of the sentence. And so, but in broadcast, this is an example of the worst brutality I've ever come across. It could be the anchor's opinion, right? So broadcast option 1, the judge said the police beating of a man under arrest was, in his words, the worst brutality I've ever come across. That's one good way of putting it. Another way that you might do it is the judge described the beating of the arrested man as the worst brutality he had ever come across. And that's paraphrased, and it works too. What do you think's better in that instance? You know how sometimes they say there is no right answer? I think there's a right answer to this.
The second one?
Yeah, I think the second one's better. And I think the second one's better because there's nothing noteworthy, unusual, or unique in how he said the worst brutality I've ever come across. Anybody could have said that. And do we get anything different if we use that instead of paraphrasing it, that he described the beating of the arrested man as the worst brutality he had ever come across? We really don't. And so, yeah, I think the second one's better. You know, he doesn't have to say in his words, and you know, so your anchor, you know, she's not going to have as hard a time reading that. So some stuff about some quotes. Now then, finally, I always put this in stuff because I love this. Avoid cliches like the plague. It's, you know, it's useful to keep in mind that you want your writing to be fresh, and if you just use the same little phrases that everybody uses, well, you know, a cliche didn't start off as a cliche, did it? It started off as a really clever way of putting something, and then when everybody used it for a long time, it became a cliche, and it becomes, ugh, it's a tired old phrase now, and we don't want to use it anymore. So you want to keep an eye on those, and you know, write things more simply. And so final reminder is this: a newscast can survive without good pictures, compelling video. It's not going to be ideal. I don't know that a news station, a television thing, could survive long term without good pictures. I mean, eventually people might quit watching, but you know, a particular story, if it's got a strong script, the words can carry it. But the video is not going to save bad writing. Good video is not going to save bad writing. You want both, but the one's not going to, you know, the one's not going to. If you have to have one, get good writing. Of course, you want to have all three, right? You want to have good writing. You want to have good pictures, good video, and you want to have good sound, which is what I hope we're getting off of this microphone here. That's hooked up to the phone there in the back. So we'll wrap this up, and now we'll go and take care of any other work you guys have got to do downstairs.